The American soldier stepped forward, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel. His rifle hung at his side. His eyes were hard, cold, unreadable. He stopped in front of Liesel Brauer and spoke two words that made her blood freeze colder than the December wind cutting through her bones. "Open your coat." Liesel's hands trembled at her sides. She was 23 years old, a nurse who had spent the last 2 years bandaging wounds and holding the hands of dying boys. Now, she stood in a line of 47 German women, nurses, telegraph operators, secretaries, all captured when the Americans overran their field hospital near the Ardennes forest. The year was 1944. The war was almost over, but nobody had told the snow or the hunger or the fear. Liesel looked down at her thin grey coat, the one she had worn for 3 winters. She looked at the American's face. She had heard the stories. Every German woman had heard the stories. What soldiers did to women when cities fell. The women beside her began to weep. Martha Kleinhoff, only 19, started shaking so violently that her teeth chattered like machine gun fire. Old Frau Hoffmann, who was 56 and had 3 sons somewhere on the Eastern Front, closed her eyes and began to pray in a whisper. Vater unser, der du bist im Himmel. Our Father, who art in heaven. Liesel understood why they prayed. She understood why they cried. When armies swept through villages, women became prizes. She had seen what the retreating soldiers had done to Polish women, to French women. War made monsters of men. And now, she was the prey. The American repeated his command, louder this time. "Open your coat." His German was rough, broken, but the meaning was clear. Liesel's fingers moved to the top button of her coat. The metal was so cold it burned her skin. She could not breathe, she could not think, she could only obey. The first button came undone, then the second. The other women in line watched her with hollow eyes. Some had already collapsed to their knees. Some stood frozen, waiting for their turn. The American camp sprawled behind the soldier, rows of tents, trucks with white stars painted on their doors, barbed wire stretching toward a grey horizon. Smoke rose from somewhere deeper in the camp, carrying the smell of cooking meat. Liesel's empty stomach twisted. She had not eaten in 4 days. The third button came free. Cold air rushed against her chest, against the thin nurse's uniform beneath her coat. She remembered her mother's face the last time she had seen her, standing in the doorway of their farmhouse in Bavaria, waving as Liesel boarded the train to join the medical corps. "Come home safe," her mother had said. "Come home whole." Liesel did not feel whole now. She felt like a rabbit in a trap. The American took another step forward. He was close enough now that Liesel could see the stubble on his jaw, the dirt beneath his fingernails, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. He was young, maybe 25. Just a boy, really, wearing a man's uniform. Just a boy with a gun and the power to do whatever he wanted. There were no rules anymore. There was no law. There was only survival. Liesel pulled her coat open and stood with her arms at her sides, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the soldier's shoulder. If this was how she would die, if this was how her dignity would be stripped away, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had held boys as they bled out on operating tables. She had sawed through bone when there was no anesthetic left. She was Liesel Brauer. She would not break. The American reached toward her. His hand moved past her face, past her neck, past her chest, and stopped at the inside pocket of her coat. He pulled out a small leather wallet. Liesel's identification papers. Her photograph from 3 years ago, when her cheeks were still round and her eyes still bright. The soldier studied the photo, then looked at her face. He nodded once, slipped the papers back into her pocket, and moved to the next woman in line. "Open your coat," he said to Marta. Liesel stood there, coat still hanging open, heart still hammering against her ribs. She did not understand. What was happening? What were they looking for? Behind her, a female American officer emerged from one of the tents, carrying a clipboard and a stack of blankets. And that was when Liesel realized the truth that would change everything. 3 weeks before the Americans captured her, Liesel Brauer was elbow deep in a young soldier's abdomen trying to find the bullet that was killing him. The field hospital had once been a schoolhouse. Now the blackboards were splattered with blood, and the desks had been replaced with cots. There were 40 wounded men in this room, and only 3 nurses to care for them. The doctor had been dead for 2 days, killed by a shell that had collapsed the eastern wall, and Liesel was the closest thing they had to a surgeon. She had never been trained to operate. She had only watched. But watching was enough when there was no one else. The soldier beneath her hands was maybe 17. His name was Friedrich, and he kept asking for his mother. "Mutti," he whispered, his lips cracked and pale. "Mutti, ich hab Angst." "Mother, I'm scared." Liesel worked faster. Her fingers found the bullet lodged near his spine. She had no proper tools, only a kitchen knife sterilized over a candle flame and a pair of sewing scissors. She had no anesthetic, only a rag soaked in schnapps that Friedrich had bitten until he passed out from the pain. The other nurses, Marta and Ingrid, held lanterns above the operating table while bombs fell somewhere in the distance. The ground shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. A crucifix on the wall tilted sideways but did not fall. Liesel pulled the bullet free and held it up to the flickering light. Such a small thing. A piece of metal no bigger than her thumbnail. Yet it had nearly stolen a boy's life. She dropped it into a tin cup with a metallic ping and began stitching the wound closed. Friedrich would live. This time. When she finished, Liesel walked outside and leaned against the stone wall of the schoolhouse. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp as scattered glass. Somewhere to the west, the sky glowed orange with fire. Another town burning, another piece of Germany turning to ash. She lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and drew the smoke deep into her lungs. She had started smoking a year ago, when the supply trucks stopped bringing real food and started bringing only fear. Nicotine kept her hands steady. It kept her awake during the 20-hour shifts. It reminded her that she was still alive. A voice came from the darkness. "You saved him." Liesel turned to see Ingrid Voss, the oldest of the nurses, emerging from the shadows. Ingrid was 38, a widow whose husband had died at Stalingrad. She moved like a ghost these days, speaking rarely, eating less. "He will lose the use of his left leg," Liesel said. "I did not save him. I condemned him to a life of crutches and phantom pain." Ingrid stood beside her and looked up at the stars. A life is still a life. Some men in that room will never see another sunrise. Friedrich will, because of you. Liesel did not answer. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a woman standing in a burning building, throwing cups of water at the flames. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if no one was allowed to say it. The Americans were pushing through France. The Russians were closing in from the east. Germany was a dying animal, thrashing and snapping, but dying all the same. And the nurses of Field Hospital 47 were caught in the middle, with nowhere to run and no one coming to save them. In 3 weeks, the Americans would find them, and everything would change. That night, as Liesel tried to sleep on a cot that smelled of blood and disinfectant, she dreamed of home. She dreamed of her mother's kitchen, where bread baked golden in the oven and sunlight poured through the windows like honey. She dreamed of her younger brother, Hans, who had been 16 when he was drafted, and 18 when he disappeared somewhere in Italy. She dreamed of her father, the schoolteacher, who had refused to join the party and paid for it, with his job, his reputation, his health. She dreamed of the life she had before the bombs and the blood. When she woke, her cheeks were wet with tears, and the distant thunder of artillery had grown closer. The Americans were coming. Liesel could feel them like a storm on the horizon, gathering strength, gathering speed. She did not know yet what that storm would bring. She only knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The Americans arrived on a Tuesday, just as the first snow of December began to fall. Liesel was changing Friedrich's bandages when she heard the rumble of engines, not the familiar growl of German trucks, but something different, something heavier, something foreign. She ran to the window and saw them, a convoy of olive-green vehicles rolling through the village like a river of steel. White stars marked their doors. American flags snapped in the wind. And at the front of the column, a tank, its cannon swiveling slowly from side to side, scanning for threats. Marta appeared at Liesel's shoulder, her face pale as milk. "What do we do?" Liesel's mind raced. The wounded could not be moved. Some of them would die if they were lifted from their cots. But if the Americans saw the German uniforms, the German weapons, the German soldiers— "Burn the weapons," Liesel said quickly. "Burn anything with a swastika. Change the soldiers into civilian clothes if we have any. Move." The next 15 minutes were chaos. Nurses stripped uniforms from half-conscious men. They threw rifles and pistols into the fireplace, where they smoked and sparked. They ripped propaganda posters from the walls and fed them to the flames. Ingrid found a white sheet and hung it from the schoolhouse window. A flag of surrender, a desperate plea for mercy. Liesel worked faster than she had ever worked in her life, but it was not fast enough. The door burst open, and 3 American soldiers stormed in, their guns raised, their shouts filling the room with a language Liesel barely understood. "Hands up! Everyone hands up, now!" Liesel raised her hands. She watched as the soldiers swept through the room, kicking over supply crates, throwing open cabinets. One of them stopped in front of Friedrich's cot and stared at the fresh bandages on his stomach. The boy was still unconscious, his breathing shallow, his face grey. The soldier said something in English that Liesel did not understand. Then he looked at her and asked, in broken German, "You do this? You fix him?" Liesel nodded. She did not know what else to do. The soldier studied her for a long moment, then lowered his gun. He turned to his companions and spoke rapidly. Orders, perhaps, or explanations. Liesel caught only fragments. Doctor, hospital, women. Then the soldiers left, and for a brief, impossible moment, Liesel thought they might be safe. That hope died an hour later. A new group of soldiers arrived, led by a captain with a clipboard. He gathered all the women in the courtyard, the nurses, the cooks, the telegraph operators who had been hiding in the cellar. "You are now prisoners of the United States Army," the captain announced in precise, textbook German. "You will be transported to a holding facility for processing. Any resistance will be met with force. Any attempt to escape will result in execution. Do you understand?" The women nodded. No one spoke. No one cried. Not yet. The tears would come later, in the back of the canvas-covered truck, as the schoolhouse disappeared behind them and the future stretched ahead like a road into darkness. Liesel sat between Marta and Ingrid, her hands clasped in her lap. She thought about her mother, who did not know where she was. She thought about Friedrich, who would wake up to find his nurses gone. She thought about the soldier who had looked at her bandages and lowered his gun. Was that mercy? Was that respect? Or was it something else? Something she did not yet have a name for? The American POW camp was not what Liesel had expected. She had imagined barbed wire and guard towers, beatings and starvation, the cruelty that she had been taught to expect from the enemy. Instead, she found rows of canvas tents, each one heated by a small iron stove. She found blankets that were rough but warm. She found food, real food, that arrived 3 times a day. Thick stews with chunks of meat, bread that was soft and fresh, canned peaches that tasted like summer. On her second night in the camp, Marta turned to her with wonder in her eyes. "They feed us better than our own army fed us," she whispered. "Is this a trick? Are they fattening us for something?" Liesel did not answer. She was watching the American guards, trying to read their faces, their intentions. They carried rifles but rarely raised them. They shouted orders but rarely struck anyone. And they had women among them, female soldiers in the same olive uniforms, carrying the same equipment, doing the same jobs. Liesel had never seen anything like it. In Germany, women served as nurses, secretaries, switchboard operators, support roles, background roles. But here, American women drove trucks and organized supply lines and gave orders to men. One of them approached Liesel on the 3rd day. Her name was Captain Ruth Calloway, and she had dark skin that shocked the German prisoners into whispers. Liesel had never spoken to a black person before. She had been taught that such people were inferior, dangerous, less than human. But Captain Calloway spoke with authority and intelligence, and her German was better than most of the male soldiers. "I am in charge of processing the female prisoners," Captain Calloway said, her voice calm and professional. "You are Liesel Brauer. You were a nurse at Field Hospital 47. Is that correct?" Liesel nodded, still staring. The captain smiled just slightly. "You may close your mouth, Fräulein Brauer. I am not an exotic animal." Liesel felt her cheeks flush with shame. "I apologize. I did not mean—" "You meant nothing," Captain Calloway said gently. "You were taught lies. It is not your fault you believed them. But now, you are seeing the truth. And that is the first step towards something better." The captain consulted her clipboard. "You operated on wounded soldiers. You saved lives. We have recorded testimony from several men in your hospital. They speak highly of you." Liesel did not know what to say. She had expected interrogation, accusation, perhaps a tribunal. Instead, she was being praised. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Captain Calloway looked up from her clipboard. Her eyes were steady. "Because we are not monsters, Fräulein Brauer, and neither are you." The next morning, the women were lined up for what the Americans called processing. Liesel now understood what that meant. Identification checks, health examinations, documentation for the official records. The order to open her coat had not been a prelude to violence. It had been a search for hidden weapons, for stolen documents, for contraband. The Americans were efficient, methodical, almost bureaucratic in their treatment of prisoners. They did not torture, they did not humiliate, they followed procedures. But not all the women believed it. Frau Hoffmann still flinched whenever a male soldier came too close. Marta still cried in her sleep, haunted by nightmares of what she thought would happen. The stories they had been told about American soldiers, stories of rape and murder and savage cruelty, clung to them like cobwebs, impossible to shake. And then, on the 4th day, everything changed again. On the 4th day, Captain Calloway gathered all 47 women in the main tent and made an announcement that turned Liesel's world upside down. "We have been authorized to offer certain prisoners the opportunity to work," the captain said. "As nurses. Your medical skills are needed. There are wounded soldiers, American soldiers, who require care. If you volunteer, you will receive additional rations and improved accommodations. You will also be treated not as prisoners, but as non-combatant medical personnel. The tent erupted in whispers. Work for the enemy. Heal the men who had conquered their homeland. Some women shook their heads in disgust. Others looked at their thin wrists and growling stomachs and considered the offer more carefully. Marta leaned close to Liesel. What do we do? Liesel thought of Friedrich, the boy she had saved. She thought of all the boys she had saved. Did it matter what color uniform they wore? That night, Liesel could not sleep. She lay on her cot and stared at the canvas ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside and the quiet sobs of women who had lost everything. She thought about duty. She thought about survival. She thought about the oath she had taken when she became a nurse, an oath to preserve life, regardless of nationality or politics. The next morning, she was the first to volunteer. 12 other women joined her. They were given clean uniforms, white dresses with red crosses on the sleeves, and escorted to the American Field Hospital on the other side of the camp. The conditions there were better than anything Liesel had seen in 2 years. Clean beds, working lights, actual medical equipment. But the wounded were just as broken. Young men with shattered limbs and burned faces, crying for their mothers in English instead of German. Liesel's first patient was a boy from Kansas named Thomas. He was 19 years old and a mortar had taken both his legs below the knee. When he saw her, a German woman in a nurse's uniform, his eyes widened with fear. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" Liesel picked up a clean bandage and approached his bed. "I am here to change your dressings," she said carefully, her English rough and uncertain. "I am nurse. I help you." Thomas stared at her. "You're German. You're the enemy." Liesel paused. She looked at the stumps where his legs had been, wrapped in gauze that was already seeping red. "Right now," she said, "you are a wounded boy, and I am a nurse. That is all that matters." She changed his bandages. She gave him water. She held his hand when the pain became too much. And by the time she left his bedside, something had shifted in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something that might someday become trust. It was a small thing, a tiny seed. But in the frozen soil of war, even tiny seeds mattered. But Liesel was hiding something, a secret that could destroy everything she was building. In the pocket of her old grey coat, which she had not surrendered during processing, there was a photograph of her brother Hans, in his Wehrmacht uniform standing beside a tank marked with the insignia of a unit that had committed atrocities in Italy. Liesel did not know if Hans had participated in those atrocities. She did not know if he was alive or dead. But if the Americans found that photograph, they would assume the worst. They would assume she was a Nazi sympathizer, a war criminal's sister, an enemy collaborator. They would throw her back into the general population, or worse. So Liesel hid the photograph and told herself it did not matter. She told herself she was doing the right thing. But every night, as she lay awake, she felt the weight of that secret pressing against her heart. 2 weeks into her work at the American hospital, Liesel was summoned to Captain Calloway's office. The tent was small but orderly, with a wooden desk and a single kerosene lamp. The captain sat behind the desk, her face unreadable, a folder open in front of her. "Sit down, Fräulein Brauer." Liesel sat. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain the captain could hear it. Had they found the photograph? Had someone reported her? Was this the end? Captain Calloway closed the folder and looked up. "You have been doing excellent work," she said. "The The soldiers speak highly of you. Private Thomas, in particular, has requested that you be assigned to his care permanently. Liesel blinked. He requested me? Yes. He says you are kind. He says you treat him like a human being, not like a wounded animal. The captain leaned back in her chair. I'm going to be honest with you, Fräulein Brauer. When this war ends, and it will end soon, Germany will need to be rebuilt. Not just the buildings, the people. The hatred on both sides runs deep, and it will take generations to heal. But people like you, people who can see past the uniform to the human being, underneath, you will be essential. Liesel did not know what to say. She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and forced them back. Why are you telling me this? Captain Calloway smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a woman who had seen too much suffering and still believed in hope. Because I want you to know that your work matters. And because, she paused, because I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. The captain opened the folder again and slid a photograph across the desk. Liesel's blood turned to ice. It was the photograph of Hans, her brother, her secret. This was found in your coat during the initial processing, Captain Calloway said. The soldier who found it was young and distracted and forgot to report it. He only remembered yesterday. Liesel could not breathe. The room was spinning. This was it. This was the end of everything. Your brother, the captain continued, Hans Brauer. He was assigned to the 16th Panzer Division. He was present at the massacre of Marzabotto. Do you know what happened at Marzabotto? Liesel shook her head, but the shaking was a lie. She knew. Everyone knew, even if they pretended not to. The 16th Panzer Division had killed nearly 800 Italian civilians, women, children, elderly, priests, in retaliation for partisan attacks. It was one of the worst atrocities of the war, and her brother had been there. I don't know if he participated, Liesel whispered. I don't know what he did. We stopped receiving letters a year ago. I don't even know if he's still alive. Captain Calloway studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched like a wire pulled tight, ready to snap. I believe you, the captain said finally. I believe you did not know what your brother did, and I believe you are not responsible for his actions. Liesel let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. However, the captain continued, I cannot ignore this. I am required to report it to my superiors. There will be an investigation. You will be questioned. Your work at the hospital will be suspended pending the outcome. But the patients will be cared for by others. Captain Calloway's voice was firm but not unkind. I am sorry, Fräulein Brauer, truly. But war has rules, even if those rules feel unjust. You will remain in the camp under supervision. You will not be harmed. But until the investigation is complete, you cannot work. Liesel left the captain's office in a daze. Her legs carried her to the edge of the camp where the barbed wire met the frozen forest. She stood there until the sun set, watching the trees turn to shadows, feeling the cold seep into her bones. Marta found her there, shivering and silent. What happened? Marta asked. What did she say? Liesel did not answer. She could not find the words to explain that everything she had built, the fragile trust, the hope, the possibility of redemption, was crumbling around her. That night, she dreamed of Hans. He was standing in a field of sunflowers, the way he had looked when he was 12 years old, before the war, before everything. He was smiling, waving to her, calling her name. But when she ran toward him, the sunflowers turned to ash, and Hans turned to smoke, and Liesel woke screaming, alone in the dark, clutching a photograph of a ghost. The investigation lasted 5 days. Liesel was questioned by 3 different officers. 2 men and 1 woman, who asked the same questions again and again. Did she know about Marzabotto? Did she approve of what happened? Did she have any contact with Nazi officials? Did she believe in the ideology of the Third Reich? She answered honestly, even when honesty felt dangerous. No, she had not known about the massacre, not until after the war had ended. No, she had never approved of violence against civilians. No, she had never been a member of the party. Her father's refusal had made that impossible. And no, she did not believe in the ideology that had destroyed her country and killed millions of innocent people. She believed in medicine, in healing, in the sacred duty to preserve human life. On the 5th day, Captain Calloway summoned her again. The captain looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her uniform was wrinkled in a way that suggested she had slept in it. "The investigation is complete," Captain Calloway said. "I have advocated on your behalf. So have several of the soldiers you treated, including Private Thomas. His letter was particularly persuasive." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. "You are cleared to return to work. The photograph of your brother has been filed, but no action will be taken against you. You are not responsible for his crimes." Liesel's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. It was an official document, stamped and signed, declaring her innocent of collaboration. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would the soldiers speak for me? I am the enemy." Captain Calloway stood and walked to the tent flap. She pulled it aside, revealing the grey December sky. "Fräulein Brauer," she said, "I have learned something in this war. Enemies are created by politics, by borders, by men in rooms who never have to hold a dying boy in their arms. But people, ordinary people, are not enemies. They are just people trying to survive, trying to do what is right. You saved German soldiers because it was right. Now, American soldiers have spoken for you because it was right. That is not politics. That is humanity." Liesel clutched the paper to her chest. She thought of her mother, waiting in Bavaria, not knowing if her daughter was alive. She thought of Hans, wherever he was, alive or dead, guilty or innocent. She thought of Thomas, the boy from Kansas, who had lost his legs but not his capacity for forgiveness. And she understood, finally, what Captain Calloway meant. War created enemies. But peace, fragile, precious peace, was built by people who chose to see each other as human beings. Liesel returned to work that afternoon. Thomas was waiting for her, propped up in his bed, a crooked smile on his face. "I heard you were in trouble," he said. "I wrote a letter. Told them you were the best nurse in the whole damn camp. Probably the best nurse in the whole damn world." Liesel felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She did not try to stop them. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that for me?" Thomas shrugged. "Because you changed my bandages when nobody else wanted to touch a German. Because you held my hand when I was scared. Because you looked at me like I was a person, not just a pair of missing legs." He reached out and took her hand. "That's what matters, right? Not the uniform. The person inside it." Liesel squeezed his hand. She could not speak, but she did not need to. Some truths were beyond words. The war ended 5 months later, in May of 1945. Liesel remained at the camp until the last prisoner was processed, the last wounded soldier healed. Then she went home to Bavaria, to the farmhouse where her mother waited with open arms and tear-streaked cheeks. Hans never came home. They learned eventually that he had died in Italy, killed by partisans 3 weeks before the massacre at Marzabotto. He had never participated in the atrocity. He had been dead before it happened. Liesel wept for her brother, for the boy who had chased butterflies in summer fields, for the young man who had marched off to war believing he was doing his duty. And then she dried her eyes and returned to work. She became a doctor. She dedicated her life to healing, to building bridges, to proving that humanity could triumph over hatred. Every year, on the anniversary of her capture, she wrote a letter to Thomas. And every year, he wrote back. They never met again in person, but they never forgot each other. And that connection, forged in the ashes of war, reminded them both what was possible when people chose compassion over cruelty, understanding over fear. Because in the end, that was the lesson of the war. Not that evil was powerful, anyone could see that, but that goodness was stronger. That one nurse changing one bandage, one captain speaking one truth, one soldier writing one letter. These small acts could change the world. The end. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me what moment hit you the hardest. And if you're watching at 3 a.m. somewhere in the world, unable to sleep, know that you're not alone. Stories like these remind us of who we can be, not who we sometimes are. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.